On June 22, 1940, inside a railway carriage deep in the forest of Compiègne, the very same carriage where Germany had once signed its surrender in 1918, French representatives now signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. 6 weeks of brutal combat had cost the lives of 90,000 French soldiers and 60,000 civilians. Over 10 million people had fled southward, creating the largest mass exodus Europe had ever witnessed. At last, it seemed the fighting was done. France had fallen. But across the English Channel, Winston Churchill declared that Britain would stand and continue the fight alone. Meanwhile, in the streets of Paris, now under the control of German forces, occupation had begun. In the villages of Normandy, still bearing the smoke and scars of recent bombardments, and in the so-called unoccupied southern zone where desperate refugees pack themselves into every corner they can find, French civilians received the news, and their reactions are far from what anyone might have anticipated. The way they respond reveals something deep and unsettling about loss, about endurance, and about the fragile spark of hope that survives even as one's nation collapses while an ally refuses to yield. The reactions divide people in ways no one could have predicted. Simone de Beauvoir, 32 years old, sits inside a Paris cafe now regularly filled with German officers. In her diary, she notes a feeling of shameful relief at the signing of the armistice. The fighting has ended, the killing has ceased, and her friends are no longer perishing in battle. Yet when she learns that Britain has chosen not to surrender, she writes something entirely different. The English are insane, she writes. They'll be invaded within a matter of weeks. So what was the purpose of all this suffering? She isn't the only one who feels this way. All across Paris, and throughout the occupied regions of France, countless others share her sense of exhaustion and disbelief. They have watched their nation's army crumble in barely 6 weeks, seen endless lines of refugees choking the roads, witnessed dive bombers scream overhead, and German tanks rolling past monuments once believed to be eternal. The thought that Britain, its small army barely escaped from Dunkirk, stripped of weapons and vehicles, could possibly stand against Germany seems like pure delusion. In the city of Lyon, a woman whose name has long since vanished from record but whose words survive in a letter to her sister in America, writes her thoughts with weary conviction. The British fled from Dunkirk and abandoned us to face the Germans on our own. Now they claim they'll continue the fight? Let them. We've endured enough of this war. That resentment toward Britain is both genuine and widespread. During the evacuation at Dunkirk, the British Expeditionary Force managed to rescue 338,000 troops, among them 123,000 French soldiers, but they left behind every piece of heavy weaponry. France was left to continue the battle alone. And now, from the safety of their island, the British dare to call France's surrender disgraceful. In the cafés of Marseille, and in the provisional capital at Vichy, where Pétain's new government is taking shape, a cynical joke circulates from table to table: the British will fight to the last French soldier. Yet, step into other neighborhoods and speak with different people, and an entirely opposite sentiment emerges. In a small village in Brittany, a fisherman named Jean-Marie Cervella stands on the shoreline, gazing across the channel toward England. He's 41, too old to have been called to serve, but both of his sons were taken prisoner during the fighting, and he has no idea whether they're still alive. When word reaches him that Churchill has sworn Britain will continue to fight, an unexpected feeling stirs within him: hope. If the English keep fighting, he tells his wife quietly, then it isn't over. Then maybe our boys will come home. In the unoccupied zone, in towns and villages scattered across southern France, many others begin to see Britain's defiance not as reckless stubbornness, but as an act of immense courage. A schoolteacher in Toulouse records a thought in her diary: Pétain tells us we must accept defeat with dignity. But the English have refused to accept it at all. So which of us truly shows dignity? Class differences shape these reactions. The bourgeoisie, the property owners, the comfortable families, those tied to the old order, mostly favor Pétain's armistice. They've watched their world collapse into uncertainty, and the armistice promises them stability, a restoration of order, a return to traditional values. Pétain's slogans about work, family, and fatherland strike a comforting note. By contrast, Britain's resolve to continue the fight feels to them like a threat, a path to endless turmoil. But among workers, among the left-leaning, among those who have long distrusted the ruling class and the system that serves it, the reaction is very different. Britain's decision to continue fighting ignites a very different reaction among others. In Saint-Étienne, a factory worker turns to his fellow laborers and says, "The wealthy have made their peace with the Germans, but the English workers are still fighting. Maybe this war isn't finished after all." The contrast between regions is striking. In the occupied northern territories, where German troops march through the streets and their rules dictate daily existence, expressing sympathy for Britain is dangerous. People stay silent, concealing their true feelings. Late at night, they tune in to the BBC in secret, the radio volume turned low, curtains tightly drawn. And when they catch the faint signal of the BBC's French broadcast. When the BBC reports on Britain's unwavering determination, some listeners feel a small spark reignite inside them, a spark they thought had been extinguished. Others dismiss the broadcasts as lies, insisting that Britain will surrender within a few weeks. In the unoccupied southern region, the Vichy zone, people can speak more freely, but the government's stance is unmistakable. Marshal Pétain's administration blames Britain for France's downfall. Newspapers, now under Vichy control, publish stories condemning Britain's so-called betrayal and abandonment of France. They confidently predict that Germany will invade Britain within a month and claim France was wise to make peace. Many accept this narrative. A merchant living in Vichy writes to his brother, Pétain has saved France from total ruin. The Marshal knows exactly what he's doing. The English are simply being stubborn and foolish. When they're invaded, some say, they'll regret not making peace as we did. Yet others begin to notice inconsistencies. In Clermont-Ferrand, a librarian observes something peculiar. The Vichy newspapers keep repeating that Britain's defeat is inevitable. If they were truly certain of that, she tells her husband, they wouldn't need to keep insisting on it. Then comes July 3, 1940. The British Royal Navy launches an attack on the French fleet anchored at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria. The British government fears that these warships might soon be seized by Germany. The French admiral, however, refuses to surrender his vessels or to take them to British-controlled ports. The British open fire. 1,297 French sailors are killed. The news spreads like wildfire across France. In Paris, in Lyon, in Marseille, and in villages throughout both zones, French civilians respond with shock and outrage. Even those who had supported Britain's decision to continue the fight feel a sense of betrayal. The British have taken the lives of French sailors. Former allies have now become executioners. A woman in Bordeaux, whose cousin was killed at Mers el-Kabir, writes in her diary, I wanted to believe the English were our friends, that one day they would come to liberate us. Now I see that they are just as much our enemies as the Germans. They have slaughtered our boys. Vichy propaganda seizes upon this incident. Posters are plastered across the streets depicting British warships attacking French sailors. Newspapers run bold headlines accusing Britain of betrayal. Pétain himself condemns the violent assault. Over the following weeks, French public opinion shifts sharply against Britain. Even clandestine resistors, even those who despise Vichy, wrestle with the implications of Britain's actions. A young man in Paris, who would later join the resistance, recalls years later, Pétain made me despise the English for months. I understood their strategic reasoning, but understanding did not quell the anger. Yet here is what is truly remarkable. The anger does not persist for everyone. As summer fades into autumn and the Battle of Britain rages across the skies above England, a change begins to take shape. German bombers cross the Channel day after day. The Luftwaffe is expected to crush Britain within weeks. Vichy newspapers confidently predict an imminent British surrender. German newsreels depict burning British cities. The invasion, Operation Sea Lion, is said to be imminent. Yet Britain refuses to capitulate. The RAF strikes back. German losses continue to rise. Weeks pass into months, and Britain remains unbroken, still resisting, still defiant. French civilians begin to take notice. In occupied Paris, a baker named Henri Dubois listens intently to the BBC on a secretly hidden radio. He listens to reports of RAF successes, of German bombers being shot down. He cannot be sure if it is mere propaganda, if the British are exaggerating their victories, yet he notices that the Germans appear uneasy. The invasion, predicted first for August, then for September, never arrives. Perhaps, he whispers to his wife in the quiet of their bedroom, the English are not as defeated as we believed. In the unoccupied southern zone, a farmer watches German newsreels at the local cinema. The reels show British cities ablaze, but they also show something unexpected. They show British citizens refusing to surrender. They show Churchill delivering his speeches. The farmer, who had once thought Britain's decision to fight on was reckless and foolish, begins to reconsider. By the winter of 1940 into 1941, French public opinion is gradually shifting. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but in certain circles, in certain hearts, Britain's continued survival alters people's calculations. A young woman in Lyon, Lucy Aubrac, who would later become a prominent resistance leader, reflects on this period in her writings. When Britain did not collapse, when it withstood the bombing, when it continued fighting month after month, it stirred something within us. It made the idea of resistance feel attainable. If they could endure alone against Germany, perhaps we, too, did not have to accept defeat. Class divisions continue to exist but begin to shift. The bourgeoisie who had backed Vichy start to hedge their bets. Perhaps Britain will endure. Perhaps Germany will not ultimately triumph. It is safer to watch what one says, just in case. A businessman in Toulouse, who had previously praised Pétain's wisdom in seeking peace, begins telling others that he had always believed Britain would hold firm. Among workers, among the left, Britain's survival sparks growing resistance. Communist workers in Paris, despite the Nazi-Soviet pact still being in effect, interpret Britain's fight as evidence that fascism can be resisted. Socialist workers in Marseille begin organizing. Britain's example instills courage, yet the regional divide continues to deepen. In the German-occupied North, control is absolute. Even expressing support for Britain privately is dangerous. The Gestapo, along with French collaborationist police, arrests anyone suspected of listening to the BBC, spreading Gaullist propaganda, or showing hope for British victory. In Lille, a woman is arrested simply for saying she wishes Britain would win. She spends 6 months in prison. Meanwhile, in the unoccupied South, there is more room to think, to speak cautiously, and to hold on to hope. The Vichy government continues to officially oppose Britain, but it cannot monitor every private conversation. In homes and during private moments, people quietly discuss what Britain's survival could signify. A teacher in Montpellier assigns his students essays about the ongoing war. One 14-year-old student writes, "Marshal Pétain says we must accept our defeat, but the English show that surrender can be refused. I do not know who is right, but I know which choice makes me feel less ashamed." The teacher conceals the essay, choosing not to report it to the authorities. He begins to suspect that the boy might be onto something important. By 1941 and into 1942, as Britain not only survives but begins to fight back and the war spreads to Russia and then America, French civilian opinion continues its complex and evolving course. Those who had once viewed Britain's decision to fight on as mere stubbornness now recognize it as strategic wisdom. Those who had felt angered by British abandonment now place their hope in Britain's eventual liberation. Those who had supported Vichy's collaboration quietly begin to distance themselves from it. Yet nothing is ever simple. A woman in Paris, whose brother died at Mers el-Kabir, never forgives Britain even after liberation. A man in Bordeaux, who had lauded British courage in 1940, becomes a collaborator in 1942, deciding that Germany will ultimately prevail. In Normandy, a family divides. The father supports Vichy, while the sons join the resistance, inspired by Britain's example. A daughter marries a German officer. The variety of French opinions and the complexity of French reactions reveal something profound about defeat and hope. When France surrendered and Britain continued to fight, French civilians did not respond as a single entity. They responded as millions of individuals, each carrying their own fears, their own hopes, and their own calculations about survival, dignity, and the uncertain future. Some perceived British defiance as noble. Others saw it as foolish. Some saw both. Some changed their minds over time, while others never did. A man in Toulouse, who had been captured during the fighting and later released, writes to his sister in 1943. "When we surrendered and the English continued fighting, I believed they were foolish. I thought they would be invaded within weeks and that we would all end up under German rule anyway. So, what was the purpose of more death? But they were not invaded. They kept on fighting. And now I am part of the resistance. The English were correct. Some things are worth fighting for, even after you have lost." Yet his sister responds in a letter, "You say the English were right, but how many more French lives were lost because they continued fighting? How many more cities were bombed? Perhaps if everyone had made peace in 1940, we would all still be alive and whole. Perhaps the English simply extended the suffering." Both letters have survived in archives. Both perspectives are genuine. Neither is complete without the other. The story of how French civilians reacted when Britain continued fighting while France surrendered is not a tale of a single response. It is a story of millions of reactions evolving over time, shaped by social class, region, politics, personal experience, hope, fear, anger, and admiration, all intertwined. In the occupied North, a woman shelters a British pilot who has been shot down. She endangers her life to help him escape. When later asked why she did it, she replies, "Because when we surrendered, they did not." Someone had to remember that resisting was possible. In the same city, just a few streets away, another woman reports a neighbor for listening to the BBC. She supports Pétain's vision of a new France at peace with Germany. She believes the British are needlessly prolonging the war. She is not a villain. She is a woman striving to survive, trusting the authorities who insist that collaboration is the path to peace. In the southern zone, the mayor of a small village refuses to enforce Vichy's anti-Jewish laws. When questioned about his actions, he replies, "The English are still fighting. That means this isn't over. That means we do not have to obey these orders." By his defiance, he saves 17 Jewish families. In the next village, another mayor zealously enforces the same laws. He believes that Vichy embodies France's future. He considers Britain's ongoing fight to be a British issue, not a French one. He perceives no link between British defiance and the choices he makes. By 1944, as Allied forces ready their invasion, as the resistance strengthens, and as Vichy's authority collapses, French public opinion has shifted profoundly. Most French civilians now hope for liberation by the Allies. Most now recognize that Britain's decision to continue fighting was the right choice. But this is hindsight. This reflects the perspective from victory. In June 1940, standing amid the ruins of defeat, watching their nation surrender while their ally continued to fight, French civilians had no way of knowing how events would turn out. They had to interpret it using the information available to them, shaped by their fears, hopes, exhaustion, anger, and everything else that defines human experience. Some witnessed British defiance and felt abandoned. Some saw it and felt hope. Some experienced both emotions simultaneously. Some changed their perspective over time. Some never did. Every one of them was French. Every one of them was striving to survive. Every one of them was reacting to an impossible circumstance with the resources at their disposal. An elderly woman in Provence asked in 1945 what she had thought when Britain continued to fight while France surrendered, she says, "I thought they were insane. I thought they would be annihilated. I thought we would all be destroyed. Yet, deep down, I also felt that perhaps insanity was exactly what the moment demanded. Perhaps sanity meant surrender, and madness meant hope. And perhaps, just perhaps, we needed more madness." She pauses, gazing at the interviewer. I was right. We needed the madness. We needed someone to defy the logic of defeat. Even if it was the English, even if they had abandoned us at Dunkirk, even if they had killed our sailors at Mers el Kabir, we needed someone to demonstrate that saying no was still possible. Then she adds, "Although I didn't know. Back in 1940, she says, in 1940, I simply believed they were insane." That uncertainty, that not knowing, that experience of living through history without any clue of its outcome, that was the reality facing French civilians during the summer of 1940. They had no way of knowing that Britain would endure. They did not know that America would enter the war. They had no certainty that liberation would come. All they knew was that their own country had surrendered, while their ally had not. And they were forced to interpret what that difference meant. Their responses varied, because they were human. Because human beings are complex. Because feelings of defeat and hope, fear and bravery, do not follow simple rules. Some French civilians celebrated British determination. Others cursed it. And some did both. Some people changed their opinions as time passed. Some never did. What they expressed when Britain continued to fight while France had surrendered encompassed everything. It contained anger and admiration. It contained despair and hope. It contained feelings of betrayal and bursts of inspiration. It was all of it at once. Millions of voices reacting to an impossible moment, each in their own unique way. And that complexity, that refusal to fit neatly into a simple story, is what makes their responses profoundly human, strikingly real, and absolutely worth remembering. They weren't characters in a tale with obvious heroes and villains. They were ordinary people striving to survive, attempting to make sense of catastrophe, trying to determine what to believe while the world collapsed around them. Some people understood correctly, some misunderstood. Most understood partly correctly and partly incorrectly, just as any of us would in similar circumstances, just as we do today when confronted with our own impossible choices, forced to decide whether to surrender or to keep fighting, whether to cling to hope or succumb to despair, whether to view defiance as bravery or folly. The French civilians of 1940 had no awareness that they were making history. They were simply trying to survive it. What they said, what they thought, what they felt, it was all genuine, all valid, all part of the vast, intricate truth of experiencing the collapse of your world and having to determine what comes next.